Now, as for immigration trends, this is the time of the first great wave of immigration. And it's important for you to understand for APUS, in terms of getting things in order, there's three great waves of immigration that take place in the United States. We'll discuss the other two as we come to them later on in our narrative. But the first great wave is the 1830s to 1850s, predominantly made up of settlers from Northern and Western Europe, predominantly Protestants, with the exception of the Irish, Scandinavians, Anglo-Saxons, and an awful lot of Germans, and the Irish being the one big exception. The Germans and the Northwestern Europeans, Scandinavians, Anglo-Saxons, the French, Welsh, Dutch, etc., they were largely an economically diverse group. They came and settled as farmers or as tradesmen, as craftspeople, and were able to establish their station and establish an economic footing far more rapidly than the Irish. The Irish came in large numbers as a result, as we said, of famines and revolutions taking place in Europe, instability during this time, and also the growing reputation of the United States as a place in which they could, elevate their station in life. They came largely as poor or desperately poor migrants. And this was part of the reserve labor pool we talked about that could drive down the prices of wages for Americans who were already trying to compete with them as laborers. Needless to say, this is going to create an awful lot of hostility towards the Irish as unwelcome immigrants who were going to take American jobs. These urban concentrations of Irish who were semi-skilled or unskilled meant they could demand very little in the way of wages and had very few options. They settled in what we would call ethnic enclaves, certain parts of town that were just for the Irish, and there's a lot of discrimination against them during this time. Because there was so much discrimination, the phrase NINA, no Irish need apply, was, for instance, a placard you'd see in many workplaces. Since the Irish were denied many opportunities or worked at the lowest, most menial tasks, cheap labor, manual labor, etc., they had a couple choices. They had to either work within their own community amongst themselves, which they would try to do, or they could go to the one set of jobs that couldn't be denied them, jobs in politics, because once they got enough people here, they could establish a voting bloc and could vote in their representatives into local and regional government. And as such, you saw the beginnings and merits of political activism for the Irish, as over time they began to increase their representation in things like the newly emerging police departments and fire departments and city services and government employment jobs that were in these areas, because in many ways they've been denied a whole lot of other opportunities to raise their station. They could work at plenty of other jobs that were unskilled and had low wages. They couldn't work any jobs and rise above that, except through the ironic means of getting into weaving their way into the tapestry of local and regional government, which they then promptly proceeded to do. Existing Americans saw the Irish in many ways as wage labor threats, unwelcome wage competition, but also did not welcome their Catholicism. Remember, the United States was founded as, in many ways, a nation of Protestants that was deeply skeptical and suspicious of Catholicism and the Irish loyalties to their religion. And so you saw in many ways a nativist response based upon economic and religious principles. The order to Star Spangled Banner, and later on an actual political party, the American or Know Nothing Party, which was devoted to immigrant restriction in the 1830s, or in the 1840s and 1850s. The order to Star Spangled Banner being a sort of non-political, or at least non-nationally political, locally and regionally active group of American citizens, as they call themselves, native-born American citizens, trying to protect America from what they would see and be characterized in later units and later times as these hordes of immigrants coming in who were going to overwhelm the nation and take away our ability to be that unique special thing that we had been for so long, as they saw it. Now on to the South, as we're going to talk, moving beyond the North and the immigration characteristics. The South had far fewer immigrants because, after all, as an agrarian society, these new immigrants weren't coming in able to get land, and as an aristocratic, plantation-driven agricultural society, it took a fair amount of capital to really engage in an awful lot of the agriculture that was going to be tried to be exploited in the South. So the South had its own substantive key regional characteristics we talked about. We discussed how the Upper South was in many ways a region that was more diverse. If you look at my map here, the orange shows you this Upper South, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, were areas of special farming, truck farming, fruit farming, but also dairy, or not dairy farming, but general farming. The pink represents what you would call the Cotton Belt, or the so-called Black Belt of the South. This is where the plantation model was going to take hold, and even small landholders were going to be growing cotton, whether they were going to have a large amount of slaves or very few. So within this model, we see some very important facts about the Cotton Kingdom we need to lay out to you. It's very important for you to understand at this point in time that most Southern whites did not own slaves. They simply couldn't afford them. A slave cost $2,000 to $5,000 in their, $500 to $2,000 in their money, which in equivalent figures today would be somewhere around $5,000 or $7,000 to $20,000 to $25,000. So you can understand that a plantation where someone owns 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 slaves, you're talking about people at the richest 1% of that society, the truly upper echelons of wealth and power, to be able to move that kind of money and to purchase and control those kinds of people. Now, the Upper South, because of its general farming nature, actually had more slaves than it needed. And so you had an internal slave trade take place as slaves were literally sold down the river into the Black Belt where they were needed in major amounts. Slaves were found in all southern states, all occupations, and obviously they were going to, in some states, such as South Carolina, they were going to outnumber the number of whites in that state. But what this does economically, it has consequences for the South. It creates a single path to wealth. In the Southern culture, the Southern mindset, acquiring wealth is about acquiring land and acquiring slaves and acquiring more slaves and acquiring more land. So you have no mechanization, no urbanization, no industrialization. The South is essentially a peasant society, an aristocratic peasant society, in some ways not all too unlike the societies of Eastern Europe that we'd seen during this time, with little fiefdoms, if you will, in a post-Middle Ages period. There's no infrastructure development in many ways. Now, in terms of the global economics, as we hinted on in some earlier lessons, the cotton gin transformed Southern life. It makes slavery and large-scale cotton production pay. Southerners would then process this cotton by using the cotton gin to take the seeds out of it, would take this raw cotton and then ship it to global markets in England or in New England, in which it was made into finished goods. So the South is largely almost like a colonial economic system, purely exporting raw materials and importing and purchasing all of its finished goods. This will explain Southern dislike of tariffs. They don't like taxes on imports because they buy everything they need from the outside world because they don't produce what they need on their own besides large-scale, large volume amounts of cotton. Now, in terms of the class setup in the South, as we said, most Southern whites did not own slaves. Something like 0.1% owned over 100 slaves. And if you did own a slave, you were more likely to own them in numbers of, say, 3 to 5, 4 to 6, something like that. So for most whites who dealt with slaves, their experience was to have a handful of them around. For most African Americans as slaves, their experience was being on a large plantation with several dozen or several hundred other slaves that were in their same lot. So whites and blacks had very different views, very different perspectives on what the slave experience was, simply by even what they were surrounded by as they lived through it. But this is the difference then between aristocracy, yeomen, and the dirt poor. The aristocracy of the South was that small upper echelon owning most of the slaves. The yeomen were the independent farmers of the South. And there's a difference between plantations and households. On a plantation, slaves literally did work for the master. In a household, if I have 1 to 5 slaves, the slaves actually work with me. I work with them in the fields because I have a very modest economic enterprise going on. There was much more of a collaborative sense of endeavor, even though this person was my property and I could do with them what I wished and they had no rights whatsoever. It was much more of shared experiences versus the master and the slave on a plantation had radically different experiences that were not shared at all in terms of labor and daily life. Now, when it comes to slavery, an AP term for it is going to be the peculiar institution. This was the Southern phrase for what they called their way of life. It's an important term for you to know. And this peculiar institution was not shared by all Southerners, even though many aspirationally sought to move into that model even if they would never get there. The quote-unquote dirt poor of the South, if you will, the bottom 10% of the population that were underrepresented, lived in semi-dependency, were more in the mountainous upcountry of Georgia, the mountainous upcountry of Tennessee, the so-called hillbillies, if you will, of the South. They in many ways resented the Southern aristocracy that seemed to rule everything. Even though some of them might aspire to be it, they resented the fact that they kind of had no access to it. Some of these regions were even openly anti-slavery because they despised the aristocracy that the slave power system engendered, and we'll see that a bit later on. But slavery itself is many things beyond just simply work. It's a labor system, but it's also a complex series of human relationships. As we said, that if you worked with a few slaves as a white master, your relationships with them are going to be very different than if you were a master on a plantation with several hundred slaves. And so what was slavery like becomes a real tough question to answer, because it did vary radically, even though you could certainly say that it's going to be this brutal, dehumanizing, and degrading experience that was going to be the prism through which the entire African American experience in the United States had to be viewed, in terms of where the African American cultures come from, the worldviews come from, and in many ways the social order in the United States as it stands for the next 100 years comes from this model out of this time period where the white South feels that the poorest white is still better than the best slave. And that's going to be part of this social hierarchy. It's going to be very difficult to shift with all the emotional and personal baggage that comes along with that.